Next, I want to take a look at how to pass functions into other functions. And I currently cover that best in my book, Learn Scala 3 the Fast Way, in lesson 59. So let's take a look at that. And as I note in this first paragraph, earlier in the book, I noticed that collections methods like for each, filter, and map are higher order functions. And this just means that they're functions that accept other functions as input parameters. And in those lessons, I showed that you could pass anonymous functions into these higher order functions to achieve a desired effect. So let's take a look at those examples real quick. And the first example I show is the for each method on a list. So here I create a variable named strings, and it's a list that contains these three strings. And then what I do here is I call the for each method on strings, and then I pass in this anonymous function. And the way you read this is that you say, for every string s in the list strings, what I want to do is print something. So I want to take that variable s, and I want to call length on it. So I want to print the length of every string in the list strings. So when I hit enter, it will do just that. In the book, I also showed this filter example, so we'll take a look at that one. Paste that in here, and so you read this again similarly, and now you say, instead of calling for each, I'm calling filter. And what I want to do here in this anonymous function is retain. I think of filter as meaning retain. So I want to retain all elements whose length is greater than 4. So that's where you come up here and you look at this list right there. So I want to retain the strings whose length is greater than 4. And notice in this example, I've taken the Scala shortcut. So when you want to write an anonymous function in the longhand form, you use this syntax right here. You say, I want to transform. We call this guy the transformation symbol right there. So I want to transform every string into this result. And that's the long form again. And then the short form is we can replace the S portion with the underscore under certain conditions. And I defined when and how you can use this earlier in this video series, so I won't get into that again here too much. And so now the variable A here has that new list of strings, and it contains gen right there. In the book, I also do a map example. So we take that one and paste it back over here. And you read this one similarly. So again, for every string in strings, transform each one of those to uppercase. So you see that result there. And again, this uses that shortcut. And if I didn't want to use that shortcut approach, I could have written it like this. For every string in strings, transform each string to uppercase. And when you first start with Scala, this can be easier to read. And then once you get used to things, I find that this is easier to read. And now the purpose of this lesson is to show how you can pass a real function like these. I call this a real function, and these other ones are anonymous functions. But really, there's not a special name for this type of function. We just call it a function or a method. So I want to show how to use these types of functions with higher order functions like for each, filter, and map. So I'm going to start. I will copy that one. Let me clear this. Paste that in there. So this is a function that is called isEven, and the way this works is you pass in an int. As you see here, you pass in an integer, and it will tell you if that integer is even. So that one is false, and that one is true, and so on. And so what this does is it takes this input parameter I, which is an int, and it checks the modulus. So the modulus is the remainder of a division operation. So it takes that modulus and says if it's equal to 0, then this must be an even number. So I'll return true. So when you pass in 2, so 2 modulo 2 is 0, because that's 2 divided by 0, and then the remainder of that is 0. But if you had 3 divided by 2, the remainder of that is not 0, so it returns false. And then if you had 4 divided by 2, the remainder of that is 0, so that would be true, and so on. And now in this paragraph here, I get into this point, and I do say that not only can higher order functions take anonymous functions, they can also take regular functions like isEven. So let's take this list right here and paste that one in. We have that, and now we can pass isEven into there. So I could say int.filter. And one way to solve this problem is with the anonymous function. So I could say for each I, and then transform that into I modulo 2 equal 0. And again, this guy is an anonymous function. So I say for each I, run this anonymous function right here. And that's exact same as the one that's in isEven. So if I hit enter there, you get 2 and 4. But instead of doing that, the purpose of what I'm trying to show is you could pass that regular function in here. So you can pass in isEven and you get the exact same result. So that's really cool. And Scala does some magic behind the scenes for you that allows you to do this and this, but you really don't have to know anything about that magic. Like in Scala 2, you might have had to know a little bit about this magic. In Scala 3, you don't have to know anything about it. It's totally transparent, so you can just pass a function right in there like that. And if you haven't seen this before, I explain how this works in this section right here. So int is a list of int, or a list of integers. Filter passes one element at a time to your function. So isEven is the function, and filter is passing one element at a time into there. Filter is also a higher order function that takes your function as an input parameter, and then it has this requirement. Your function must take int as input, and that's because this is a list of int. If it was a list of string, then your function would have to take a string as an input. But because it is a list of int, your function must take an int as input, and it must return a Boolean. And that's exactly what isEven does. And we can see that back over here where I define isEven. It takes an int here, and then it transforms that into a Boolean. So that matches this description that I have right there. And to explain this a little more, we'll take a look at the Scala doc here for the filter method. So this is the Scala doc for the list class, and you can see list over here. I guess if I just scroll up, you can see this is for the list class. Oops, right there. Let me go back there. And now we scroll down to the filter function. And so now you see that description here. So what this means inside of here, and I can't click it because the way this website works, but filter is defined here in the Scala doc as a method on the list class, and it takes a predicate. So when you see a P on the Scala doc, generally that stands for a predicate, and a predicate is just a function that returns a Boolean. That's all that means. So filter takes a predicate, and it takes the type A. So again, that's the type inside the list. So my list was a list of int, so therefore my predicate must take an int as input and then return the Boolean type. And that's exactly what isEven does. So again, going back to isEven, that's exactly what it does. It takes an int as input and transforms that into a Boolean. And therefore, isEven can be passed into the filter method for this particular list, which is a list of int. And one more thing I want to show while I'm in this area is I took a couple of shortcuts here by just passing in isEven. And what I should have probably done first was say for each integer I, pass that I into the isEven function like that. And you get the exact same result. So what I didn't explain is that this is the long form for passing in a function like isEven. A shorter form looks like this. And then the shortest possible form looks like this. Again, all three of these work, and they're just different forms that you can use. And as I've mentioned, this tends to be the easiest when you're first starting with Scala. Somewhere along the line, you'll learn that this is a shortcut for all of this. And then in this particular situation where I is only used once and it's passed into this function, it can be used as the shortcut right there. And so experienced Scala developers will use this form right here, and that's why I showed that first. Then as the second example, what we'll do is look at the map function. So here I show how to pass a truncate function into map, and we'll take a look at that. So let's take that truncate function right there, clear the REPL so you don't have to see all that. So there's the truncate function, and what it does is it truncates the string that's passed in here down to 2 characters with the take method right there. So take says take the first two characters from this string that's passed in. And as an example how that works, I could say truncate, and I will give it my name, Alvin, and then that will return a string AL. And now I show, so I had this list here, and I'll come back here, paste that one in, and scoot that up so we can type this in. So now we will say val b equals a map. And I'll start with the long form this time. So then I'll say for each string in that list of strings, truncate each string as you go along. So what map does is it marches through your list one string at a time through Jin, then Cassian, then Bodhi. And then as it works on each one, it's going to say, okay, truncate Jin, next truncate Cassian, next truncate Bodhi. And that's the way this code works. And so you see it returns a list of these strings that have been truncated. I wish the REPL showed these in double quotes because this is a list of strings, but it doesn't do that. But that does show how this example works. And I showed that long form first. And now I can show the shorter form here. and then the shortest possible form there. And this particular example works because A right here is a list of strings. So it's a list that contains all strings. And I'm calling map. And the way map works is for a list of string, it's going to require a function that transforms a string into anything else. So this could transform this into integers, could transform it into doubles, or anything else in the world that you want to transform it into. But the key is that your function must take a string as input. And that's exactly what truncate does, is it takes a string as input, and it just happens to return a string here. And to drive home that point, it could be a length function. So we could say length of string, and this one is going to return an int. So then that's going to be s.length, like that. And now I could say val c equals a.map, and I'll just do the shortcut right away. So we'll just do length. So again, the only thing important about length is it takes a string as input. And as I mentioned, this function can return anything in the world you want it to. And I just happen to return an int for this example here. And you can see this in the Scala doc here. So this is the map method for the list class. And you can see it takes a parameter f. So they show f here is a function. So in the Scala doc, f generally stands for a function, just like p generally stands for a predicate. And the way you read this is that f is a function, and it transforms a generic type A into the generic type B. And then it returns a new list, and the new list has the type B. So if I scroll this guy up here, so what this means here, this A and B stuff, is A is the type that's contained in the list. So I go back to the list here. So A in this example is a string. So string is the type that's contained in this particular list. So you can think of string as being right here where that A is. And then your function transforms each string into something else. So in the second example, I use length, and I transform that string here into an int. So you can think of B as being an int. And then the result of calling map is going to be this new list. And in this particular example, it's going to be a list of int. And that's what you see right here, is that when I apply the length function to this list, calling map, the result of that is a new list of int. So in this particular example, you can replace A with a string, because these are all strings right here. And then B is an int, because I use this function to transform each element into an int. And so the resulting list, where it says list B, is this list of int right here. And if you've ever read the Scala doc and this sort of thing looked kind of scary, I hope that helped explain it, and it's a little bit less scary now. And to wrap this up, in this lesson, I show how map works. I describe how it works here, and it's basically everything that I just said. And I also show another example here. And you notice in the first example, I had truncated this to take two elements right there. And what I do in this example here is I define truncate to take two input parameters. So it takes a string just like before. And here I also take a max length as another input parameter. So then it passes in max length into take right here. And now you can still pass this into map, which is what I show here. So let's go ahead and copy this. One last thing. So come over here, paste truncate in. And that's so I can see my list here. And then what we can do is say val D in this case. So then I'll say A map. And now you can pass in truncate. So again, we're working on strings. So I'll do the long form first here. So I pass that into truncate. And I will say I want to truncate that string and then down to 3 characters in this case. So actually earlier I did 2 characters like that. And now I can pass in 3 characters like that, and so on. You can do 3 and 4 and so on. And the purpose of this example was to show that map can also use a function that takes more parameters, and you just have to pass those parameters in like that. So here S stands for each individual string in A. And so I pass that S in here, and then I can pass in other parameters to this function here. So this could pass in 2 parameters, 3 parameters, 4, whatever, it doesn't matter. And then here I show that you could pass this in like this, so you could use the underscore as I did before. So let's just do that to make this complete. So then either one of these syntaxes work. You can pass this anonymous function in that way, and you can pass this one in with the underscore shortcut that way.